Hey everyone, welcome to another episode from Ampro Engineering. This is the Tamiya Hilux. This is the 58028 Hilux. It doesn't belong to me. I don't own one. This actually belongs to one of my friends, Showdog. You can see him on Tamiya Club and a number of forums on Facebook. He's pretty easy to find. Thank you very much for joining me and letting me prod your Hilux.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
Now, I know very little about this, so walk me through it. I know that a portion of it looks like the Bruzer, but another portion of it looks nothing like the Bruzer, and the tires are small.
So a lot of people mistakenly think that the Bruzer and the Hilux was very similar, but they're so different. Difference in the way the chassis was made and constructed, and the ability to have a front locking and unlocking hub. While they look similar, completely different. I would imagine that the Tamiya spent a lot of money developing this and the Bruzer by using separate parts.
Yeah, no, and the body looks to be nearly a direct bolt-on, but I did notice that the Bruzer has very irritating little holes here for the little brush guard, or the Nerf bars, I should say, whereas this doesn't. So it does look like that they possibly modified the mold to leverage the amount of money that they spent in this. But in looking at the truck very slightly in the time that it's been here, I have noticed very few parts that are actually interchangeable. Would you agree?
I would agree.
That's
so
interesting.
the front cabs are very similar, and I think they did the same way that they modified the Sand Scorcher to fit the Monster Beetle and Blitzer Beetle body. I think they did the same thing with the Hilux front body to get it so they could use it for the Bruzer. It has a different way of attaching. As you can see, the radio box comes apart by flipping the tabs.
These little tabs here.
Yep. And then
I'm terrified right now. I know how valuable these trucks are.
so slightly lift up the lid, and then you'll see that there's some tabs that go into the back of the body shell. Gently slide that out. Now a lot of people try to get these bodies off without doing this step, and they end up breaking the tabs on the radio box. And as you can see,
Oh, I see it's stuck on the servo horn right there.
yeah,
Oh my gosh. There he goes. Okay. So these little tabs right here you're talking about, correct?
yeah, that's the really difficult thing when we're storing one of these trucks. Finding one with unbroken tabs is almost impossible. Most of the time they were broken off,
And this would just lift off.
and
there.
that just lifts straight off now.
Okay, so interesting. So the rear panel, those of you with a Bruzer or a Hilux or the high lift Hilux or any other of these newer versions of this truck, this would be significantly more open, and the back window piece drops in from the bottom and has little legs that stick out here that kind of align everything here. On this case, it looks like this whole back panel is separate.
It is. It's a separate panel, and then the glass for the Hilux has a rear panel, as opposed to Bruzer is just the three sides, the two passenger, driver door, and front windshield.
Okay, so you'd have this part that is separate.
Yeah. So with the Hilux, it has that molded in with the glass.
And do these three screws hold the back of the seat compartment?
Yes, they do. Yep.
Okay. Is the seat compartment? Oh, actually, I was gonna say, is it the same as the Bruzer? But it looks
No,
like it isn't.
It's different. Yeah.
There's the
It has a
notch.
little different. It's deeper so that it allows the driver to sit lower in the car, and then also it has those rear attachment points. And then you'll notice that there's no side attachment point like it is on the Mountaineer and Bruzer. So that's where the seat attaches to the side on the Mountaineer and Bruzer. So
Yeah.
that's what makes it completely different for the Hilux.
Yeah, there's a lot more complexity in here, just trying to get the little nut. I can imagine that that's quite a great deal of fun to try and screw all this together. The front panel looks to be identical.
They look identical. The only difference is the 2mm screws there as opposed to 3mm.
Oh,
on
I
the Bruzer.
see that. Let me get it. So to compare the original Bruzer, which this happens to be a Bruzer, even though the shell's been cut off on this one here, the interior would attach right here on the sides, whereas on the original Hilux, that part does not exist. In fact, the whole method of it attaching to the chassis, as we saw a moment ago, was much different. One of the real nice things about this particular body shell is the fact that the side vents don't have that little screw hole sticking
That's
out
correct,
of it.
yeah. Or the ones to mount the
Yeah.
Nerf bars down below.
All down here, which we can compare again. You'd have this one and this one, which hold the Nerf bar in place, and then these two M3 screws hold the bed on. Whereas on this truck, You have none of that. You have this little screw down here, which appears to hold the rear panel on. And then I did notice, then you mentioned a little while earlier that we had an M2 here.
Yes.
Versus the M3 on this truck here. And I suspect that that was done for usability. It's always a bit more fiddly to use it, to mess with the smaller screws. Yeah, these little legs that hold it all together are quite small. So if you are going to, start kind of, I don't want to say abusing, but putting these things through the wear and tear that Tamiya recommended in their promotional videos, it seems that you would have a lot more difficulty in keeping these trucks in one piece. Now, I do want to talk about reliability, but we'll skip that for now, and we'll kind of further explore the truck. Now, another part that is obviously very different to a number of these newer Tamiya pickups is the rear. This is the factory bed portion for the Tamiya Hilux, the 58028 Hilux. Tamiya is usually pretty good about making scale products, so I have seen on Tamiya Club that at some point someone found a picture from like 1979, 1980 of a full-size Toyota pickup with a very similar bed. Do you know much about the bed? Did it originally exist on a Chevy Love or something? And where did the taillights come from? Obviously, they don't look like they're something that you've seen commonly on a pickup truck. Any idea?
I don't think here in the U.S. that we had very many of the step-side Hiluxes. I think that was more distributed around the world. While searched out pictures on Google, you can see the step-side trucks that are very similar in fashion. But I think a lot of it too is Tamiya. They don't make it exactly like it because with licensing issues and such, I think they have to maybe pay more. I don't know. It's hard to say because sometimes they just kind of fall short in the authentic sizing.
That's very, very true. Yeah, I was just curious. I didn't even think about the non-US model Hiluxes if these had been sold like this. But I was just kind of thinking about how when the Tamiya made the Midnight Pumpkin, they kind of based it on Rolling Thunder Rolling Thunder was the lunchbox.
Yes,
I believe.
Yeah, and there was a Midnight Pumpkin 56 Ford.
Yeah.
I don't recall the name of that.
But like you mentioned, they take inspiration, but they may not make an exact replica. But this is a very interesting bed because obviously there is no drop bed whatsoever, and it's because that entire battery box did reside underneath here. All right, with the body off, we have access to the entire chassis, and the first thing that's going to stand out is this giant box at the rear. Its size is exactly why there's no drop bed in that rear bed portion, and stop me if I'm incorrect here, Show Dog, but it seems that the reason for this is to help keep water out of the electronics, because at the time we didn't have sealed or waterproof speed controls and waterproof servos and water resistant.
They were so susceptible to water. So
yes.
You had what was called a water resistant box. They would never say waterproof, they'd say water resistant. And in the promo videos, it shows them running the trucks through the water. And they are pretty water resistant, but they're definitely not waterproof if you submerge it.
And what's interesting about this is it does show that the all three servos do connect to this rotating bar, which protrudes through the bottom to help prevent the water from the outside going to the inside.
And they double as a servo saver.
And the Bruzer was not that way. The Bruzer had a similar box, but at the bottom, the servo arms were just coming out of a
rubber slit.
Yep.
Yeah.
3 servos here. We have one for our shift linkage for the transmission. We have one for our steering. And the steering is quite, I have to admit, this is quite an elegant setup because you've got this captured ball end over here, which goes through an M2 screw. And I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit here, because I never noticed this before. This captured ball end going through the M2 screw to another little metal bar, and that pivots on this, this pivots on this whole metal bracket that goes from here, and I believe it wraps around underneath, and then that is this steering linkage right here, which then steers the front end, and it has this very nicely bent arm, which helps to make the steering perpetually parallel from the steering linkage to the steering knuckle. So that is very interesting. That's incredibly complex, much more complex than the Bruzer. Now there is a third servo in here, and I'm at a loss. Is that supposed to be for the mechanical speed control?
It is.
Okay.
So it's a mechanical transistorized speed control. So inside there is various transistors, and as it moves the mechanical linkage around, similar to how like a distributor runs.
I see this.
And it hits various switches inside of that box.
So I see right here, because I didn't notice earlier, but right down in here, I see the linkage coming out of the speed control. That is interesting. And again, this is 1981. So the idea of having a speed control, an electronic speed control costing $20 was not the case. Do you know what this thing cost brand new back then?
No clue, but I bet it was pricey. It was so pricey that they didn't include it with the Blazing Blazer.
That was the budget version.
That was the budget version.
Trying
to recoup some of those production costs, I think.
Interesting. Okay. I knew that this was electronic and I knew it was transistorized, but I did not know that it took a mechanical input.
Yeah.
That is interesting. And we do have so this is a 4-channel airplane receiver. So you can see here, if you look on the receiver itself, we have notations for rudder, elevators, throttle, ailerons, and the battery. And that was because in 1981, you could not buy a land-based one, correct?
I think there was. I think that was the one that was included with this truck. I bought this used off of eBay. And so the previous owner chose an airplane radio to use it.
Interesting. Okay, because I just assumed that at that time it probably would have been a heck of a lot harder to find land-based stuff, at least in more than 2 channels. So then this large bay at the back, I see you've got a little bit of insulation in here to keep a smaller battery position, but this would have been capable of supporting the larger 4,000 milliamp Tamiya D-cell battery.
Yes. Yeah.
Now that was 7.2 volts?
6 volts.
That was 6 volts, so it wasn't...
Yeah. So it makes the truck run incredibly slow. It's already pretty slow, but the 6 volt, it just makes it incredibly slow, and it just doesn't have that extra pump to get it over some of the humps that the 7.2 would allow you to do.
Would this fit the hump pack?
I think it does.
I have one. All right, so this is the 7.2 volt, 1200 milliamp hump pack. Let's scoot that around a little bit. Yeah, it does fit. Okay. So this would have provided more power, but less runtime.
Less runtime. And you'll note, too, that the Hilux runs on a 540 sized motor, whereas the Bruzer, because of the larger wheels and stuff, ran on a 750 size motor.
And I did notice that. I noticed that this motor looked smaller than the Bruzer one, so I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to forget that. But since we've kind of made our way to the front of the car, the chassis as the transmission as a Bruzer owner looks familiar to me, except that the number of linkages here does look a little bit, I hesitate to say sloppier, but I'm going to say more complex. Now this does have 3 forward gears. You have your second and third gear that are rear wheel drive, and then you have your first gear that is 4-wheel drive. And that's where things, I think the similarities end with the Bruzer. And I'm sure that internally there may be different gear ratios. I think that there are some people out there that know them by heart, possibly. I don't know if you're one of those people.
I think the spur gear is definitely different. The front of the transmission is different because it holds a different motor. But I'm not sure in the main part of the transmission if they're the same or not. I have opened those up and re-ball raced them with ball bearings, but never really took note and never did a comparison between the Bruzer and the Hilux in that manner.
Speaking of the first gear does drive all 4 wheels, but that does not entirely going to drive all 4 wheels because as of right now, and if I'm going to tilt the truck up a little bit, these are not differential equipped.
No.
Okay. So like the Bruzer. Spools. So if we spin the front tires, you'll see that the axle is turning, and there's no surprise there. And it is turning independent of the rear because I think it's in second gear right now.
Yeah.
But this little hub here, and that's something that I think is quite famous on these trucks. If we pull the hub out slightly and turn it around a little bit, does it drop? There it goes. So it drops in here.
And now that unlocks the hub.
And now we are able to spin this one wheel freely and not actually spin the hub. And the reason for that is we are talking about a very large truck, and when this truck is on pavement or some sort of a surface with a lot of traction, the inability to spin the front tires independently of each other, I would imagine, would cause not only a lot of drag but a lot of wear and tear.
Yeah, a lot of wear and tear on the axles, and the axles and the knuckles on the Hilux are more scale and more delicate than what was found on the Bruzer. So you really had to be careful. If you ran these trucks in the manner that they were portrayed on the promotional videos, they wouldn't last very long at all. I think they kind of overstated the durability on them.
Yeah, there was a lot of jumping and rock crawling with those. And you did mention that on this truck here, you have replaced the springs with Bruzer Springs.
Yeah, so to give it a little lift and a little more compliant suspension.
The original ones were much stiffer.
Super stiff.
Okay. And in looking at the original videos, and I've mentioned these videos a few times, the original Tamiya promos. If you haven't seen them, go ahead and look them up because they're really fantastic videos to watch. Definitely very period.
Very period.
But the quality of the videos in terms of how the trucks are portrayed is it kind of gives off almost that superhero effect, where it's this really amazing truck. And I'm glad you brought that up.
And teenage kids watching these in the hobby shops, it'll just make you want every single one of them.
Yeah, it worked. It definitely worked. Speaking of the chassis, this chassis is certainly not a Bruzer chassis.
No, it's made out of aluminum. It's bent in a number of different directions, a 3D bend. Not only does it gain elevation, but it has side-to-side bends. So a very complex chassis.
So like the Bruzer then, let's go ahead and grab mine very quickly. You can see, and please don't judge me for the dirtiness of mine, but this here, if you look at the outside, this is a C-channel. And in the real world of off-road driving, people tend to like to box C-channel frames because they're a little bit weaker. In this case here, you wouldn't have that issue because it is in fact a solid chassis. And just to compare the motor sizes, this you said is a 750?
750
So
size.
it's a much larger motor in comparison to the 540, which is what we have as a stock motor today. And despite the fact that these two do run the same front portion of the cabs, or at least very similar, you can see that the design of the front body mount and the Bruzer's body mount are in no way interchangeable. And that has to do with the fact that on this truck, the body sits much lower, and on the Bruzer, it sits much higher. There's one other thing that I noticed here is that the antenna is a solid wire antenna. But for the most part here, if you're familiar with the Bruzer, the Tamiya Mountaineer, you're going to be fairly familiar with this truck. With all that said, the question is, do you want to buy one? And as someone who does not own this, and in fact has already installed the battery compartment before I put the body on, the best person to ask this question to is in fact Showdog. So Showdog, if you are a collector, a Tamiya collector, do you want this truck?
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely one of the holy grail vehicles. You know, there's the Bruzer, there's the Hilux, and there's the Sand Scorcher. Those are the three most desirable trucks and cars, buggies that were made by Tamiya. So definitely as a collector, you're going to want one. But when it comes to drivability, though, you know, you're dealing with technology that was developed in the late 70s and produced in the early 80s. So, you know, driving one of these trucks makes you truly appreciate how far the technology has come in tightness of steering mechanisms, shifting smoothness, drivetrain smoothness has gotten so much substantially better in the years.
And there's also the sheer fact that replacement parts for these trucks are not only difficult to find, but will demand a premium price. For example, I couldn't help but notice how perfect these tires looked. And it's not possible to say, oh, okay, well, I think I'll just, find a set of these tires through Proline. How hard are these tires to find?
You have to just hope that they'll pop up on a set of eBay, and you have to find them in the bag because that's what seals them from the elements. Anytime they're outside of the bag, they're starting to get old and cracked. This was a brand new set that I installed around 2004, and I usually keep this truck bagged. Is to try to protect all the rubber components on it.
I can completely understand that because all the rubber is going to perish, unfortunately, over time. So as a collector, would you say find yourself a good one for a premium amount of money or get yourself a beater and try and restore it?
It depends on what you want. If you want a runner, don't spend too much money on it. If you want a collectible one, buy the most complete one you possibly can because every little part is expensive. From the side mirror that is always missing to other compartment or other parts, especially the radio box, the radio compartment. You're going to want to get the best ones because finding replacements will be few and far between and they will command a premium price.
For somebody that you mentioned, somebody that wants a runner, would this truck make a, and I will not in any way entertain the idea of a rock crawler. That is simply not going to be the case. That was not what this truck was intended to be. Is it a good trail truck for somebody that wants to take it out on the trails?
I think so. I think, you know, there's always a certain segment of people that like to run vintage vehicles. You know, sure, there's somebody that could go out and buy a brand new Ferrari, or there's somebody that's going to want to ride in a 1963 Ferrari. Yeah. So you're going to get that same feel. And like I said, once you run one of these trucks, it makes you truly appreciate how good the trucks are nowadays. But they are fun in their own aspect to run.
Just in looking at this here, I think the truck is a masterpiece. It's really, really a beautiful truck to look at. And as I've been moving this around, I've noticed that it's quite heavy. So I'm just curious what the weight is. I put my scale here. We'll go ahead and put that rim there. We'll zero that out and do our best to drop the whole truck on it. And it looks like we are at 8 pounds, 8.4 ounces. Let's compare that to a truck that is maybe a little more common or more popular today. Got my Trailfinder 2, which you can tell has more than a passing resemblance to the Hilux. Try and balance it a little bit here. You're doing pretty good there. Okay, so this is 5 pounds, 9.7 ounces. So we're talking about a delta of 3 pounds, and that's not a trivial amount. I mean, that is something of, what is that?
Consequence, definitely.
No, absolutely. It's 40% the weight less than the other truck. So when you're thinking of driving maybe this Trailfinder 2, which is relatively inexpensive in comparison to what the Hilux would be, this probably is going to be the way you want to go. And for the most part, they're dead ringers. You can even get aftermarket beds that do match the Hilux if you do like that look of the step-side bed. So Show Dog, thank you so much for bringing this truck by. It's really an amazing little piece of history. And if anybody out there does have this truck, consider yourselves quite lucky because it really is a gem.